A very confused woman called in what would likely become a drunken, disorderly charge just after midnight. She told the county police department that a freak in a BDSM suit staggered out of the forest and passed out next to her front gate. My coworkers picked short straws and Tyler lost, so was sent to pick this freak up. I was busy filing paperwork when they brought him in and turned on a little music to try and drown out the commotion. Eventually, Tyler staggered into my office. "Chief, come look at this weirdo," he said before ducking back out. I sighed, leaning back in my chair. Tyler was a good deputy, but he had the maturity of a high schooler sometimes. I capped my pen, wiped the ink smudges off my fingers with a tissue, and stood up, my knees popping in protest. The office was cramped, barely big enough for the desk and filing cabinet, and I had to sidestep a precarious stack of case files to get to the door. I walked through the lobby and unlocked the door which led to the holding cells. I saw a group of just about everyone who isn't on patrol at the time crowded around the door to the drunk tank. There was a low buzz of conversation, occasionally pierced by a burst of laughter. I elbowed past them to the front, where Clarice was filming the guy with her phone. I was about to tell her to knock it off when I actually got a good look at him. At first, I thought Tyler had been exaggerating. He wasn't. The man slumped against the back wall of the holding cell looked like something from a grainy video nasty. His outfit, if you could call it that, was a skin-tight jet black suit that covered everything. No zippers, no seams, no indication of how the hell he got into it. It had a weird sheen under the flickering fluorescent lights, which made me guess it was latex. His arms ended in stumps. There was a polished metal circle attached to the face of the suit approximately where the mouth should have been. At first, I thought 2 eye holes had been cut in the material. Looking closer, I realized that they were spaced too far apart, with the left one being elevated ever so slightly more than the right one. "Tyler," I turned to my deputy. "Did you get a good look at his eyes? Dilated pupils." "Actually, those aren't his eyes. No, they're fake. Old prosthetics, I think. Enamel," replied Tyler. Clarice kept filming. I sighed, rubbing the bridge of my nose. Clarice put the damn phone away. She huffed, but did as she was told. The rest of the staff muttered amongst themselves, shifting uncomfortably. No one was more uncomfortable than Jack. Old Jack spends more nights in that drunk tank than he does at home. That's probably his aim. This night, he was reported howling at women younger than his daughter, and was picked up staggering down the main street, rattling his empty bottle of homemade gin against the lampposts. Now he was curled up in a ball in the corner of the cell, sitting in a puddle of his own piss while swearing in Spanish at the latex man. I turned to Tyler. "Where'd you find this guy?" "Near the Banks house, you know, where the Maggot Farm murders took place in the 90s. He was face down in the dirt, completely out of it." Tyler crossed his arms. "We tried talking to him, but he hasn't said a word. Thought he was on something." I glanced back at the guy. His chest rose and fell slowly. "You searched him." Tyler shook his head. "No pockets." I sighed. "All right, let's process him, see if we can get an ID." Tyler gave me a "you're the boss" shrug and grabbed the keys off his belt. He stepped toward the cell and the man moved. Not much, just a twitch, a slight tilt of the head. When I looked at him again, he was staring right at me with his porcelain eyes. Old Jack whimpered and Tyler looked back at me. I gave him a nod that told him to keep going. Then he stood up. He looked inebriated. He found his unsure footing and stood to look at us, then back at Jack, then to us again. His suit squealed with each movement. Clarice let out a choked gasp as he lumbered towards the door. I felt a sudden, unbearable pressure in my skull, like an ice pick was being driven through my forehead. I bent double, hands on my head, and groaned like a pained cat. At first, I thought I was feeling the beginnings of a cluster headache. I've suffered from them since childhood, and spent most of my life trying to articulate how painful they are to friends and family and employers. They are the only comparison to what I felt in that moment. Then I looked up and saw that the dozen people around me were reeling from the same such pain. Then, in a voice that was neither deep nor high, neither man nor woman, the figure finally spoke. "Where am I?" With those words, the pain ended. The thing's words rang hollow in my mind, and I'm sure in the minds of the staff who surrounded me. I slowly collected myself and stood up straight, facing the thing in the cell. "You're in the county sheriff's office," I said. "Who are you?" The thing tilted his head down, considering the question. It seemed to stare at its fingerless hands before answering. "I do not know," it said. The voice wasn't muffled. I exchanged a nervous glance with Tyler. "All right," I said slowly, trying to keep things calm. "How about you tell us what you do remember? How'd you end up where you did tonight?" The thing brought its latex mittens to its face, stroking its own cheeks. "I remember darkness, a great weight, then freedom, but not mine." It communicated. Its words were like tin, and I continued to hear them longer than I should have. It was clear to me now that it wasn't speaking. We were hearing its thoughts. "Okay," I continued carefully. "Do you have a name? Anything we can call you?" "Aleph," it answered in an aggressive tone. It took a step back and then another. It stood in the center of the cell, surveying us. From behind him, old Jack whispered something to himself about the devil and spat on the concrete floor. Slowly, Aleph turned to face him. Jack looked startled, but his intoxicated rambling continued. He stopped mid-sentence while swearing to God and began to splutter and wheeze. "Jack," I called, grabbing the wheel of keys from Tyler. "Jack, stay calm, I'm coming in." As I fiddled with the lock, my co-workers around me gasped. I looked up to see Jack slowly rising, his back grinding against the wall behind him. He clawed at his throat as he fought for one more breath. Aleph stood and watched his dying agony, silently content. Jack was standing on the tips of his shoes now, and then, nothing. As he was suspended in midair, hung from an invisible noose, the door to the cell clicked open. Jack's body crumpled to the floor and the latex man rotated, facing me once again. Before I could issue a warning, it began to glide across the floor. Startled, I reached instinctively for the gun in my holster. As I did, my arm snapped forward at the elbow, shattering the joint. As Jack had done, I fell to the floor, clutching the bulging, splintered bone just under the skin. Pathetically, I started to cry as I watched the man in latex float past through the door. My deputy and close friend for a decade, Tyler, drew his pistol and leveled it at that thing's head. I watched helplessly as his hands moved backwards, clearly out of his control. Tears welled in his eyes, and he pleaded as he pressed the barrel against his forehead. I could see that he was trying to fight it, but it was useless. The gunshot was deafening. I woke up an unknowable amount of time later. I staggered to my feet, holding onto the bars for support. I realized that I had passed out from the pain, but my arm still throbbed like a second heartbeat. I picked up my fallen gun and slid it back into my holster. I looked around and saw my colleagues. They were scattered on the hall's floor. Slowly, I made my way out of the cell. The bodies that surrounded me looked like they had been run over, crushed. I tried to look at the ceiling as I walked over them, feeling the remains separate with each step. It was like walking through mud. Finally, I broke free into the main hallway. It was a nightmare. The fluorescent lights flickered erratically, casting jagged shadows over the crumpled forms of my colleagues. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder. My shattered arm hung uselessly at my side, each step sending waves of nauseating pain through my body. I clenched my teeth, forcing myself to keep moving. I had to get out. I had to find help. But as I stumbled toward the lobby, I realized something was wrong. The station was silent. No radios crackling, no phones ringing, no casual conversation between work friends. Just the faint buzz of the dying lights and the occasional drip of blood hitting the floor. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" More silence. I pushed through the door to the lobby and my heart sank. The front desk was overturned. Papers and broken equipment scattered across the floor. The windows were intact, but the world outside was wrong. The streetlights were dim, their glow muted and hazy, as if the light itself was being swallowed by the darkness. The trees beyond the parking lot swayed unnaturally and gradually drained into the darkness beyond them, like a wet watercolor painting. And then I saw it. Aleph was standing in the middle of the parking lot, its back to me. It was perfectly still, its glossy suit reflecting the faint light in distorted patterns. I froze, my hand instinctively going to my holster, but I stopped myself. I couldn't risk it. Not after what had happened to Tyler. "What are you?" I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I'd limped out into the tarmac of the parking lot now, just yards away from Aleph. When I spoke, it slowly turned around. I saw that it was desperately trying to open the metal hatch over its mouth. Defeated, it lowered its arms back down to its side. "I'm dreaming," it said. The word slithered into my skull like a snake, wet and oily. In my periphery, I could see the night sky lower itself. The darkness spread and seemed to move like a sandstorm. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain in my heart. My knees buckled and I fell to the floor, clutching my chest. When I looked back up, I saw nothing. True nothing. Surrounding me was the void. It went on forever in every conceivable direction. The only two things in this universe were me and Aleph. "What?" I said between rasping breaths. "What is this?" "It is me," replied Aleph. After a short eternity of silence, it spoke again. "I need to find the other dreamers." The silence of the void wasn't silent at all. It was a low, insectile hum, vibrating in my molars and in the marrow of my shattered arm. Aleph stood before me, his porcelain eyes reflecting nothing and everything. A void in a void. His mittened hand hovered inches from my face, the black latex glistening like the carapace of some deep-sea fish. I tried to speak, to scream, but my tongue sat dead in my mouth. Then the sirens came, not from outside but from all around. A shrill, electronic wail that seemed to peel the darkness itself into ribbons. Aleph's head snapped upward, his metal mouthpiece emitting a sound like a detuned radio. The void shuddered, reality folding like wet paper, and suddenly I was on my back on cracked asphalt. The parking lot's yellowed overhead lights buzzed and flickered. My broken arm pulsed in time with them. The SUVs arrived in a synchronized swarm, black and sleek like a posse of hearses. They skidded into formation, boxing us in with military precision. Doors flew open. Men in charcoal gray suits spilled out, their faces obscured by gas masks tinted amber. Their gloves were thick and rubbery, with the same unsettling sheen as Aleph's suit. Aleph didn't move, didn't say anything. All around me I heard men's voices barking orders into radios and receiving them twofold. The agents raised devices that looked like overgrown tasers. their prongs crackling with blue current. Aleph head tilted, almost curious. Then he raised his stumped arm. The nearest SUV levitated, not dramatically, not like movie magic. It's just unweighted, tires spinning lazily as it drifted 6 feet off the ground. The agents froze. One muttered into his comms, voice tinny through the mask. "Asset is active, I repeat, the asset is—" Aleph snapped his arm back down to its side. The SUV crumpled like a beer can, windshield exploding in a diamond spray. It hung there, a mangled sculpture before crashing down. Agents dove clear, but one wasn't fast enough. The chassis pinned his legs, his scream muffled by the mask. Chaos erupted. Tasers fired, arcs of blue lighting the dark. The current struck Aleph and wriggled around him like neon snakes. They had little effect on it. 2 agents collided midair, bones crunching. I scrambled backward, gravel biting my palms. That's when I saw him. A man in a cream-colored trench coat untouched by the bedlam. He clutched a white rabbit, its fur carefully dyed red. The creature's nose twitched, its eyes wide and alive. "Aleph!" the man called, his voice a reedy monotone. Aleph froze. A suited man collapsed from the air mid-vivisection, and the tension that blanketed the area dissipated like a deflating balloon. Aleph turned, slow and jerky, toward the rabbit. The trench-coated man stepped forward, extending the animal like an offering. Aleph reached for it needily, its mitts trembling. When it touched the rabbit, the red dye smeared onto its latex, spreading in uneven streaks. The creature didn't struggle. It just stared, its breathing rapid but steady. The man in the trench coat smiled. It didn't touch his eyes. "Good," he murmured. "Back to the garden, little king." Then he drew a pistol from his coat, an unremarkable modern handgun. He put a consoling hand on Aleph's shoulder and walked behind it. He flicked the safety off the pistol and pressed it against the back of Aleph's head as it lovingly cradled the rabbit like a newborn. The gunshot was deafening. Aleph didn't collapse dramatically, it just slumped, like a marionette with its strings cut. Its suit lost its sheen, turning dull and lifeless. The porcelain eyes stared blankly at nothing. No blood poured from the wound. The trench-coated man knelt, carefully taking the rabbit back into his hands. He touched Aleph's face and whispered something. Medics rushed to my side, their gloves cold as they strapped me to a stretcher. I didn't take my eyes off Aleph. His body lay motionless, the latex suit now just a strange, empty shell. The man in the trench coat watched as agents began loading Aleph into a black body bag. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable. Soon after, I passed out from exhaustion. The last thing I remembered was being carried into the back of a van. When I did finally wake, I was laying on my own sofa, in my own living room, in my own house. I sat up disoriented and almost had a heart attack when someone spoke from just behind me. I turned to see the man in the trench coat sitting across from me. We spoke briefly and he leaned across my coffee table to hand me a pen and a clipboard. Attached to it was a lengthy form that he told me to sign. It was a non-disclosure agreement. I asked him what would happen if I didn't, and he just stared at me. Eventually, I reluctantly picked up the pen and wrote my signature on the dotted line. The man in the trench coat cracked a smile and stood up, patting me on the shoulder. He told me that he'd be in touch and calmly strolled out of my home. He never did get in touch again. The feds swarmed the ruined police station like flies on crap. I, of course, was the last to be told what they were doing. The story that covered the local news broadcast for a few weeks was that a gang had shot the place up. Yet another unfortunate battle lost in the war against drugs. I had a teenage daughter and a beautiful wife at the time, and all I wanted was to keep my head down, I took early retirement and tried to keep away from the press. Eventually, they stopped caring. This all took place in 2009. Since then, my daughter has grown up to follow in my wake and is now the town sheriff. I've kept myself to myself, never telling anyone about that night. I live a quiet life now and enjoy my retirement. But a few weeks ago, I began to have dreams. Not since I was a young boy could I remember my dream. They'd manifest as the tiniest sliver of memory, if anything. At the start of this year, my dream became so vivid. It's almost painful. Each night since then, I've had the same dream of a red rabbit, trying to lead me deep into the forest. Tonight, I think I'll try to follow it.